Hello and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that literally affects every single one of us every minute of the day, the global energy transition. But look, we're not just talking about swapping out coal for solar panels here. We're actually talking about a fundamental, high-stakes, David versus Goliath struggle over who actually controls the power. All across the globe, everyday people are taking on this massive, stubborn, highly centralized energy establishment. It's totally fascinating, and we're going to look at the incredibly creative ways regular citizens are attempting to rewrite the rules of electricity. Okay, let's dive into this. Think about it for a second. When you flip a switch in your house, who are you actually paying? Historically, that answer has been a massive, distant, probably multinational corporation, or maybe a state-owned monopoly. You and I, we've basically just been passive consumers sitting at the very end of a long, expensive wire. But what if you weren't just a consumer? What if your neighborhood actually had a real say in how your electricity was generated, where the profits went, and exactly what it cost? The stakes for this shift are absolutely incredible. Just to put this into perspective, even with all our modern tech, a staggering 660 million people are projected to still be without access to electricity by the year 2030, and the vast majority of those individuals live in sub-Saharan Africa. What this massive number really highlights is a profound failure of the traditional centralized grid. The Goliath of our energy system, with its huge infrastructure and profit-driven motives, simply isn't reaching the communities that are remote or, frankly, just less profitable to connect. Now, let's rapidly switch lenses here, because this isn't just the challenge for the global south. If we jump over to a highly developed, wealthy nation like the Netherlands, we hit another striking number: 750,000. That is the number of Dutch households currently facing energy poverty. That means they're struggling to pay their monthly energy bills because of rising prices and poorly insulated homes. So whether we're talking about a total lack of access in rural regions or a wealthy system heavily reliant on fossil fuels that literally prices out its own citizens, the traditional centralized model is leaving a whole lot of people behind. Enter the David of our story. Now, we hear the buzzword community engagement tossed around all the time, but this explainer is focused on something way more powerful: community ownership. This isn't just about residents getting a survey and being asked for their opinion on a new solar farm. We're talking about a formalized role. It means local users are actually holding the legal and financial reins of their renewable energy systems. They own the stakes, they have the voting rights, and yeah, they keep the profits. And that brings us to a really crucial new identity in the energy world: the prosumer. This is really the protagonist in our Dutch examples. A prosumer isn't just passively buying electricity anymore. They are an everyday citizen who actively generates their own renewable energy, often right from their rooftop solar panels, and then feeds it back into the system. So they are producing and consuming at the same time. And as you can imagine, that totally disrupts the traditional business model of massive energy conglomerates. And this brilliantly illustrates the dual nature of this grassroots revolution. We're watching a movement fighting two entirely different battles simultaneously. On one side, in the global south, community ownership is literally about basic survival and economic development. It's about hitting the UN Sustainable Development Goal 7 for universal energy access, simply because the central grid isn't coming for them. On the flip side, in the Netherlands, it's about pushing a slow-moving, gas-dependent nation to actually meet its EU renewable targets, giving citizens a direct way to fight climate change and volatile markets. To really wrap our heads around how this David versus Goliath battle works in transition science, researchers use this fascinating academic theory called the multi-level perspective, or MLP. It breaks things down into three levels. First, you have the landscape. These are massive, super slow-moving cultural and economic trends, like global climate change. Second is the regime. This is Goliath. It's the stubborn status quo of existing infrastructure and entrenched corporate interests. And finally, we have the niche. This is David, the scrappy, localized, protected space where community startups and novel innovations can test things out away from the crushing pressure of the normal market. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it visualizes this exact struggle. Imagine those technological niches starting off scattered and super small. But over time, as they learn and network, they bundle together. And as pressure from that top landscape level pushes down, say through new climate goals, these scrappy little niches push up. Eventually, they break through and force that rigid, path-dependent regime in the middle to completely change its shape. The big question is, how do these local community experiments actually pull off that breakthrough? Well, in the global south, these niches often pop up as brilliant, localized off-grid solutions. In rural places across Indonesia, Thailand, and Nepal, communities just aren't waiting for the national grid to lay miles of expensive cable. Instead, local villages are building micro hydropower schemes or solar mini-grids. They're bypassing the centralized Goliath entirely. They formed local village electricity committees to manage the infrastructure, collect tariffs, and keep the power on, basically creating a totally self-sufficient energy niche. Now, if we flip back to the Netherlands, the niche looks a bit different. Here, citizens are already plugged into a highly developed grid, but they want to change where that power comes from. So everyday Dutch citizens are actually pooling their money to create energy cooperatives. Groups with hundreds or even thousands of members get together to collectively buy wind turbines and large-scale solar arrays. They are literally fighting the centralized fossil fuel regime from within the belly of the beast. But, as you'd expect, Goliath does not go down easily. What the research reveals here is incredibly striking. Despite the vast economic and geographic differences between the Global South and the Netherlands, these grassroots projects face the exact same pushback from the establishment. They all struggle with dense bureaucratic regulation, a severe lack of startup financing, major technical skill gaps, and, shocker, fierce commercial competition from massive established firms. The harsh reality is that our political and legal frameworks were historically designed for massive corporations, not, a group of neighbors sitting in a community hall. Current legislation almost always assumes a traditional divide: massive generation plants on one side, grid operators in the middle, and passive consumers at the end. Because policy naturally favors giant corporate entities that can guarantee huge volumes of power, local volunteer-run initiatives find themselves at a massive regulatory disadvantage right out of the gate. And then, of course, there's the money. Generating energy requires hardware, and hardware is expensive. High upfront investment costs are a universal barrier across the board. Traditional banks are notoriously hesitant to lend millions of dollars to a local cooperative or a village committee. Why? Because they don't have the deep pockets, the collateral, or the proven track record of a multinational energy company. So without that flexible startup capital, a lot of brilliant community projects are stifled before they can even lay down a single solar panel. Let's move to and see how this builds, because people are incredibly resourceful. When faced with these financial and legal brick walls, citizens get super creative. Here are 3 incredibly clever legal workarounds used by Dutch citizens to claim their power. First, you have Texel Energy, bypassing high land costs by renting commercial rooftops for their solar panels. Then there's Wind Park Kramer, utilizing citizen bond loans. And College Park Zwesen, an apartment complex that found a legislative loophole to supply power directly to their own tenants. Let's zoom in on the sheer scale of that Kramer project for a second, because it really proves communities can play in the big leagues. 2 separate local cooperatives realized they couldn't compete alone, so they joined forces. Together, representing 5,000 citizens, they raised millions through citizen bond loans. They successfully built an impressive 103-megawatt wind farm. They essentially formed their own corporate structure to stand toe-to-toe with massive energy firms, proving everyday citizens really can fund industrial-scale renewals. Or take a look at the localized brilliance of College Park Zweitzen. Under standard Dutch law, you need a specialized permit to supply electricity, which is obviously way too complex for a single apartment building to handle. But this building's homeowners association utilized a special, temporary government loophole called the experimentation decree. This decree granted them a legal exemption, allowing the building to supply self-generated solar power directly to its own tenants, completely bypassing national supply laws and traditional utility companies. Pretty smart, right? Now, switching back to the Global South for a moment, overcoming these barriers requires a different kind of long-term strategy. The research shows that simply parachuting in and building a microgrid just isn't enough. There is a critical skills gap. For community ownership to actually survive, these villages require continuous facilitation from NGOs and highly stable government energy policies. They need long-term training on how to maintain the hardware and manage the finances so the electricity keeps flowing long after the initial engineers pack up and leave. But sometimes the regime actually throws the niche a bone. Recognizing the growing power of the prosumer, the Dutch government introduced the postal code subsidy. It's a really brilliant financial incentive. It basically offers an electricity tax refund to households that consume energy generated by a collectively owned renewable unit, as long as it's located within their specific or directly adjacent postal code. It's a policy literally designed to reward neighbors who actively collaborate to build local solar or wind projects. But as these community niches grow more successful and, while more professional, a really critical question emerges from the literature. Will community energy actually remain truly grassroots? Think about it. To secure funding and navigate all that bureaucracy, cooperatives often have to partner with large commercial entities. For instance, that wind park Kramer project we talked about, it's actually 49% owned by a massive German turbine manufacturer. So as these projects professionalize to survive, there is a very real risk they might lose that local trust and essentially become co-opted, turning into just another corporate utility. Despite that risk, though, the ultimate goal across all these different contexts is totally clear. Whether it's a micro hydro dam in Indonesia or a wind cooperative in the Netherlands, these initiatives can't just remain isolated novelties forever. For the energy transition to truly succeed, these scattered local niches must align, scale up, and merge together. They have to transition from being cool experimental workarounds into the absolute mainstream standard for how global electrification is handled. They literally have to rewrite the rules of the Goliath energy regime. So the crucial point is, community energy is about so much more than just replacing coal with wind or gas with solar. It fundamentally shifts the entire socioeconomic landscape. It keeps investment money circulating within the local economy rather than being extracted by distant shareholders. It gives us a direct tool to fight energy poverty. It builds vital social cohesion as neighbors actually work together toward a common goal. And crucially, it vastly increases public acceptance of renewable infrastructure in local areas. It's a fundamental redistribution of wealth and power. Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and I want to leave you with a question to think about. We've seen that everyday citizens, against massive financial and bureaucratic odds, are successfully taking control of their own power grids. So take a look around your own neighborhood. If the future of energy is undeniably decentralized, what is truly stopping your community from pulling the plug on the status quo and taking ownership of the power that lights your home? Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.